1 second later, the text that came too late. David Reynolds had built his life on schedules, meetings, and deadlines. In the heart of New York, his phone buzzed more often than his own thoughts. And he carried the weight of a career that demanded every second of his attention. At 42, he had money, reputation, and a corner office with a view of the city's heartbeat. But when the lights in that office dimmed and he looked at his reflection in the glass, he saw only an exhausted man who couldn't remember the last time he laughed with his son. Emily, his wife, had grown tired of excuses. She still loved him, but her love carried a weary edge, softened by too many empty chairs at dinner and too many birthday candles blown out without him. She had learned not to argue anymore. Silence had become her protest, and silence had a way of shouting louder than words. Their son Josh, only 16, still held on to the fragile hope that his father would show up, at least once, when it mattered most. Josh's big soccer game was coming up. His team had been training for weeks, and it was the final match of the season. He had practiced harder than ever, telling himself that this time, if he played well, his father might actually be in the stands. "Dad, can you come tomorrow?" he asked the night before, standing in the doorway of David's study. His voice trembled with hope. David didn't look up from his laptop at first, his fingers still moving across the keyboard. After a pause, he glanced at Josh, guilt flickering in his eyes before habit smothered it. "I'll try, son," he said, the words flat and automatic. Josh forced a smile, nodded, and walked away. And inside he carried the ache of a promise he already knew would break. The next morning dawned bright, with sunlight spilling across the suburban streets. Emily packed water bottles and snacks, tugging Josh's jersey straight with motherly pride. "He'll come," she said softly, though her own voice betrayed doubt. Josh shrugged, trying not to care. But his eyes lingered on the empty driveway where his father's car should have been. At the office, David's phone buzzed with reminders. Meetings piled on like bricks, and every call seemed more urgent than the last. He told himself he'd leave early, just an hour before the game. But then a client crisis erupted. But leaving became impossible. His phone lit up with a text from Emily. "We're at the game. Josh is starting." He didn't open it, he just swiped it aside, telling himself he would check later. The stadium was alive with cheers. Josh ran across the field, sweat glistening on his brow, determination etched into every stride. He kept scanning the bleachers, searching for that one face, that one figure that would prove he mattered. But the seat remained empty. His chest tightened. But he pushed harder, chasing the ball like it was the only way to fill that void. When Josh scored the winning goal, the crowd erupted in thunderous applause. His teammates lifted him on their shoulders, chanting his name. But his eyes searched one last time for his father. The smile faltered, and he swallowed down disappointment as if it were part of the victory. Still, in that moment, he pulled out his phone and typed a message, his fingers trembling with pride. "Dad, I scored the winning goal. Waiting for you." But David never saw it. He was in a boardroom, presenting charts and figures to people who would forget his words by next week. His phone lay face down on the table, vibrating with the text that could have changed everything. 1 second later, the chance to be there, to celebrate his son's triumph, had slipped away. On the drive home hours later, traffic thick and endless, David finally picked up his phone. The message glowed on the screen like a quiet miracle waiting to be acknowledged. He smiled faintly, whispering, "That's my boy." He pressed the accelerator, eager to reach home and tell Josh how proud he was. But by then, the night had already changed. Emily's phone rang as she and Josh packed up after the game, laughter from his teammates still echoing in the distance. She answered without looking, expecting David at last. But it was the hospital. The words blurred, fragments stabbing through her mind. Accident, highway, multiple cars involved, critical condition. The world tilted under her feet, and her grip on Josh's shoulder tightened until he looked at her with wide, confused eyes. Josh didn't understand at first. He thought maybe they were calling about someone else, that his father was safe, just late as always. But Emily's tears betrayed the truth before her lips could form the words. She pulled him close, whispering, "Your dad's been hurt." The boy's heart, still racing from victory, stumbled into a freefall of dread. At the hospital, the sterile brightness of the halls swallowed them whole. Nurses moved quickly, voices clipped and urgent. And Emily clung to Josh's hand like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. When the doctor finally emerged, his face was heavy with the burden of news he had delivered too many times before. "We did everything we could," he said softly. "I'm so sorry." The words shattered the fragile bubble of denial Josh had been holding. Emily collapsed into sobs, her body shaking violently. Josh stood frozen, unable to cry, his young face pale and stiff, as though grief had turned him into stone. He wanted to scream, to demand they try harder. But all he could hear was the echo of the soccer field, the crowd cheering, his name being shouted, and the hollow absence of his father's voice. David's phone was handed to Emily with his belongings. A cracked watch, a wallet, and the device still glowing with the unread text. Josh snatched it, desperate, and opened his father's screen. There it was, his own message, unopened, untouched. "Dad, I scored the winning goal. Waiting for you." The timestamp mocked him. 1 second later, one choice later, everything was different. Josh's legs gave out, and he sank to the floor, clutching the phone to his chest. Emily tried to hold him, but he pushed her away, tears finally spilling. "He didn't even see it," Josh cried. "He didn't see me." His voice cracked, raw with the agony of a boy who had lived for one look of approval he would never receive. In the days that followed, the house was filled with silence. No phone calls, no laughter, no arguments. Just silence. Emily moved like a ghost, cooking meals no one ate, folding laundry no one wore. Josh locked himself in his room, the phone clutched in his hand as though it were the last piece of his father he could hold. He read the message over and over, punishing himself with its simplicity. The funeral came quickly. Suits and black dresses filled the pews. But Josh felt suffocated by the condolences, the empty phrases of people who hadn't known his father the way he had wanted to. He was a great man, they said, but in Josh's heart, he carried the ache of everything that had been left unsaid, unseen, unshared. He stood at the coffin, staring at the still face of a man who should have been cheering in the bleachers instead of lying silent in a box. When the final prayer was spoken, Josh whispered into the coffin, "I scored the winning goal, Dad." His voice broke into sobs, the weight of everything pressing down until he could hardly breathe. He dropped the phone in beside the body, unable to bear the sight of it anymore. The message had been sent, but it had never reached. The days after the funeral blurred into one another, stitched together by grief and silence. The house seemed to groan with absence, the hollow sound of a door that no longer opened, the stillness of a chair that would never again scrape the floor. Emily wandered the rooms like a sleepwalker, her eyes red but dry, as though her tears had simply run out. Josh, however, drowned quietly in his own storm. At night, he replayed the game in his mind. The roar of the crowd, the ball striking his foot, the net trembling with his shot. But in every replay, he imagined looking up and seeing his father cheering, smiling with pride. Then reality struck again, cruel and unrelenting. The seat had been empty, and the man who should have been there was lying cold and still, a mile away. His friends tried to reach him, but he ignored their calls. Their words felt meaningless, their laughter obscene against the weight crushing his chest. He sat alone in his room, staring at the wall, the silence punctuated only by the phantom vibration of a phone that no longer belonged to him. Sometimes he thought he heard his father's voice, a faint whisper telling him he was proud. But it always faded before he could hold on to it. Emily tried to help, but her own grief had hollowed her. She watched Josh retreat into himself and felt powerless, her maternal instincts clawing at her, but her spirit too broken to act. She had lost a husband and was now losing a son to despair. The guilt gnawed at her. She should have insisted David come to the game. She should have made him put family first. She should have done something, anything, to change that 1 second. Josh stopped playing soccer. The field that had once been his refuge now felt like a graveyard of broken promises. He couldn't run across the grass without seeing the empty seat, couldn't touch the ball without hearing the unspoken cheer that never came. His coach called, teammates begged him to return. But Josh shook his head, his voice cracking. What's the point? At school, his grades slipped, his shoulders hunched, his eyes dulled. Teachers whispered about trauma. Counselors offered pamphlets and patient smiles. But nothing reached him. He felt like a ghost walking among the living, trapped in the shadow of a text message that had been too late. One night, unable to sleep, Josh crept into his mother's room. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her face pale in the glow of the streetlight outside. Do you think he knew? Josh whispered, his voice trembling. Do you think he knew I scored? Emily swallowed hard, pulling him into her arms. Of course he knew, sweetheart. Fathers always know. But her words cracked, betraying her doubt. And Josh buried his face in her shoulder, sobbing quietly. Emily kissed his hair, clutching him tightly. But inside she was breaking. She wanted to believe her own words. But the image of David's unopened phone haunted her too. The text sat there like a cruel reminder. Proof that sometimes love isn't enough to bridge the gap between time and tragedy. In his dreams, Josh saw the scene replay differently. He'd look up after scoring. And David would be there, clapping, smiling, shouting his name. But the dream always twisted. The cheers drowned out by sirens. The smile replaced by silence. The stadium lights flickering out until he stood alone on the field, shrouded in darkness. He'd wake up gasping, his chest tight, the emptiness heavier than ever. Emily knew she had to pull him back before grief swallowed him whole. One evening, she sat him down at the kitchen table, the air heavy with words unsaid. Josh, she said softly, your father worked so hard because he loved us. It doesn't excuse him missing the game. But it means he wanted to give you a future. Don't let his absence take more from you than it already has. Josh stared at her, his eyes hollow. But a flicker of something, perhaps anger, perhaps longing, stirred within him. Josh didn't answer his mother that night. He sat with her words echoing in his head, bouncing between anger and sorrow. Part of him wanted to scream. How could she defend him, the man who hadn't been there when it mattered? But another part of him knew she was right. His father had worked for him, for them, for their lives. It wasn't absence born of neglect. It was absence born of misplaced priorities. And yet, the outcome was the same. An empty seat, a silent phone, a broken heart. The next morning, Josh wandered outside. The soccer field stretched before him, dew sparkling on the grass like scattered tears. He walked slowly to the goal, his sneakers sinking into the soft earth, and stood there staring at the net. He whispered into the empty air, I did it, Dad. I really did it. His voice cracked. But for the first time since the funeral, he let himself believe his father might have heard. Emily watched him from the bleachers, her chest tight with both pride and pain. She prayed silently that he would find a way back to himself, that the field would stop being a graveyard of regret and start being a place of healing. But grief was a long road, and she knew they were only at the beginning. That night, Josh found himself scrolling through old photos on his mother's phone, birthday parties, vacations, family dinners. In every picture, his father was either missing or distracted, his phone often in hand. The images stabbed at him. But then he found one picture from years ago. David sitting cross-legged on the floor, playing with a 5-year-old Josh, both of them laughing uncontrollably. The memory hit like a tidal wave. His father had been there once. He had known how to laugh, how to be present. Somewhere along the way, that man had gotten lost in the noise of success. Josh clutched the photo to his chest and sobbed. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was mourning for what had been and what had been lost. He realized then that regret wasn't just his burden. It had been his father's too. David had carried guilt, hidden beneath excuses, buried under deadlines. He had wanted to be there, but the seconds had slipped through his fingers until it was too late. In the weeks that followed, Emily encouraged Josh to return to soccer. At first he refused, shaking his head violently. But eventually he laced up his cleats again. The first time he stepped onto the field, his chest ached. But as the ball rolled at his feet, something inside him stirred. Every kick, every sprint, felt like speaking to his father in a language only they could share. During one game, when he scored, he didn't look to the stands. Instead, he closed his eyes and whispered, "That one was for you, Dad." A strange peace settled over him, fragile but real. The cheers of the crowd weren't his father's voice. But in his heart, he let himself imagine they could be. At home, Emily began to rebuild too. She started cooking again, started opening the windows to let in sunlight. The silence of the house lessened, replaced slowly with conversations, with shared meals, with small smiles. Grief still lingered in the corners, but it no longer ruled the rooms. Yet the text, that single unopened message, remained the wound that would never heal. Josh often thought of it at night, staring at the ceiling, the words glowing in his mind like neon. "Dad, I scored the winning goal. Waiting for you." A message frozen in time, forever unanswered. 1 second later, and everything had changed. Weeks turned into months. But the weight of that 1 second never left them. For Emily, it lingered in the empty side of the bed, in the sound of the front door that would never again open with his footsteps. For Josh, it lived in the shadows of the soccer field, in the spaces between cheers, in the silence after every game. They carried it like an invisible scar, pressed into their hearts. One evening, as autumn leaves painted the streets in shades of fire, Emily and Josh visited David's grave. Josh placed a soccer ball at the base of the headstone, its white surface scuffed and worn. He stood there for a long time, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Before whispering, "I wish you had seen me, Dad. I wish you had read it." The words trembled, but they carried a strength he hadn't felt before, the strength of finally speaking the truth aloud. Emily laid flowers beside the ball, her hands brushing over her son's shoulder. "He knows now," she said gently. "Wherever he is, he knows." Josh nodded, though tears still welled in his eyes. He wanted to believe her, and for a fleeting moment he did. The wind carried the faint rustle of leaves, and he imagined it as an answer, soft and distant. That night, Josh returned to the field alone. He ran drills until his lungs burned, until sweat and tears blurred together. Every kick was a conversation, every goal a confession. He whispered to the empty stands, "Are you proud now?" And though no voice answered, the silence felt different, less cruel, almost comforting. Emily watched him from a distance, her heart heavy but hopeful. She realized grief would never leave them, but it could change shape. It could be transformed from a chain into a compass, guiding them toward what mattered most: time, presence, love. She vowed silently never to repeat David's mistake, never to let seconds slip away unspent. Josh began journaling. At first, his words were jagged, angry scribbles. "Why weren't you there? Why didn't you read it?" But over time, they softened into memories, fragments of the father he had known in childhood. "I remember when you taught me to ride my bike. I remember when you carried me on your shoulders at the fair." Writing became a way to keep his father alive, to stitch the torn fabric of memory. As winter arrived, the family gathered for Christmas with Emily's relatives. The laughter felt strange at first, like borrowed joy, but slowly Josh allowed himself to join in. When his cousins asked him to play soccer in the snow, he agreed. For the first time since that night, he smiled. A real smile, not forced, not broken. Emily saw it and felt her heart swell with fragile hope. But even in joy, the lesson lingered. Josh knew that life could change in an instant. He knew that seconds mattered. Every word, every hug, every glance. And he carried that awareness like armor, a painful but precious gift from the father who hadn't been there, yet had shaped him more in absence than in presence. On New Year's Eve, Emily and Josh sat together watching the fireworks. As the sky erupted in light, Josh turned to her and whispered, "1 second can change everything." Emily nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Yes," she said, "so let's not waste any more of them." The night stretched on, filled with explosions of color and echoes of laughter. But beneath it all lay the truth they had both come to understand. The past could not be rewritten. But the future was still theirs to protect. And so they sat together, mother and son, holding tight to the seconds as they passed, determined never to let another one slip away unnoticed.